February 3, 1959. A 21-year-old pilot, a raging snowstorm, the most beautiful airplane money could buy. The next morning, they found Buddy Holly face down in a frozen Iowa cornfield and the Beechcraft Bonanza scattered across 3 acres behind him. But here is the part nobody tells you: the plane did not fail. And neither did the pilot. The real story of the forked-tailed doctor killer is far more dangerous than a nickname. Walter Beech did not want an ordinary airplane. In December 1945, his team at Beechcraft rolled out the Model 35 Bonanza, a machine built for a country that had just won a war and wanted to fly like it. The Bonanza's first flight on December 22nd was not just another test hop, it was a statement: all metal, low-wing, retractable gear, and a tail that looked like it belonged on a fighter, not a family hauler. That tail, the V-tail, was more than a styling trick. 2 slanted surfaces called ruddervators replaced the usual vertical and horizontal stabilizers. The idea was simple on paper: less drag, less weight, cleaner lines. Beech's own engineering notes claimed a 12% drag reduction, a few knots of free speed, and a cabin view with nothing blocking the sky. The FAA's type certificate, issued March 1947, listed a cruise speed of 165 knots at 75% power, with a stall at 55 knots with flaps up. The paperwork also flagged the ruddervator linkage for regular inspection, an early sign that the new geometry came with its own set of questions. Beechcraft did not aim this airplane at flight schools or weekend hobbyists. The sales brochures showed white coats and briefcases, doctors, lawyers, executives. The pitch was blunt: buy this, and you are not just a pilot, you are a man of means. The price in 1947 was $7,995, more than most houses and twice what you would pay for a 2-seat trainer. For that, you got 6 hours of endurance, a cabin that looked like a Packard, and a promise. Even a first-time pilot can master it. That promise was the trap. The Bonanza was fast, slick, and sensitive. The V-tail's control surfaces worked together, both up or down for pitch, opposite directions for yaw. The system was intuitive if you understood it, but unforgiving if you did not. The first buyers were not test pilots. They were surgeons and CEOs used to getting what they wanted, and they wanted what the ads promised: a fighter for the family man. Nobody talked about what happened when the airplane bit back. Not yet. The logbook does not care about salesmanship. It does not care about the color of your coat or the size of your bank account. It only cares about what happened and how often. Between 1982 and 1989, the AOPA Safety Foundation combed through 523 Bonanza accidents. The numbers came back cold: 73% blamed on pilot error. The most common entries were excess airspeed in a turn, mismanaged gear or flaps, and loss of control in the clouds. That is the story Beechcraft wanted told. But the ledger has another column. The National Transportation Safety Board database, running from 1962 to 2007, lists 136 in-flight breakups for the V-tail Bonanza. Over the same period, the conventional tail Bonanza, same wings, same engine, different tail, shows only 11. That is not a rounding error. That is a structural fingerprint. You can run the fatal accident rate through the old FAA tables. V-tail Bonanza, 4.9 per 100,000 hours. Cessna 195, just 2 per 100,000 hours. The V-tail's rate is more than double, even after adjusting for flight hours flown. So which is it? Pilot error or structural failure? The answer is both. And for 40 years, one side used that ambiguity to let people die. The AOPA study says most Bonanza accidents start with a mistake in the cockpit. The NTSB records say a subset end with the tail coming off, no matter who is flying. There is no myth in these numbers. There is no legend in a spreadsheet. The only thing that repeats is the pattern: a fast airplane, a proud owner, a control input too sharp or a storm too close, and sometimes a tail that was not built for the load. The breakups do not care about intention. The data does not care about blame. It only counts the bodies. This is what the numbers show. The V-tail Bonanza was not the deadliest airplane in general aviation, but when it failed in a way that left no room for second chances. And for every column of numbers, there is a family that never got an answer, just a verdict, pilot error, or structural failure. The ledger never closes. Roger Peterson's name does not show up in the sales brochures. He was 21, just a kid from Clear Lake, Iowa, working the night shift at Dwyer Flying Service. On February 3, 1959, he signed out Beechcraft Bonanza, N3794N, V-tail, Continental engine, fresh annual, and took 3 musicians into a black, sleeting sky. Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, J.P. Richardson. The press called it the day the music died. The NTSB called it loss of control in instrument conditions. Peterson had 711 hours total, but only 52 in the Bonanza. He had logged most of his time in a Piper Cub, a stick and rudder trainer that topped out at 85 miles per hour. The Bonanza was more than twice as fast, with retractable gear, a gear lever shaped like a flap lever, and a panel that looked nothing like what he had flown before. The weather at Mason City was a wall, a 500-foot ceiling, blowing snow, and wind gusting past 12 knots. Peterson was not rated for instrument flight. He went anyway. The Civil Aeronautics Board docket spells it out: spatial disorientation, nose low turn, airspeed rising past redline. The tail came off before the ground did. The crash made headlines because of who was on board, but the real story was who was flying. Not a doctor, not a daredevil, just a young pilot out of his depth in a machine designed for men who thought they could buy skill. The nicknames started here, with a Bonanza in a cornfield and a string of funerals that followed. The airplane did not care about fame. The V-tail did not care about dreams. It only cared about airspeed, load factor, and what happens when confidence outruns experience. The Bonanza's appeal was never just about speed or looks. It was about what it said about the person in the left seat. The typical new owner was not a test pilot or a line instructor. He was a surgeon from Peoria, a real estate developer from Dallas, a dentist who had finally made it. Salesmen called them doctors, but the real diagnosis was affluence with a taste for risk. These were men who could afford the best and assumed that skill came standard with the price tag. The training gap was yawning. Flight schools in the late 1940s and the 50s taught students in Cubs and Champs aircraft with fixed gear, fixed pitch, and a panel that fit on a clipboard. The Bonanza's cockpit was a different animal, a gear switch shaped almost exactly like the flap lever, both mounted side by side and moving in the same arc. NTSB files from the era are full of landings with the gear up and accidental retractions during rollout. The design was not criminal, but it was careless. A doctor used to reaching for a scalpel could grab the wrong handle at 90 knots and find himself with a propeller chewing the runway. Transition training was an afterthought. The FAA did not require a formal endorsement for high-performance single-engine airplanes until years after the Bonanza hit the market. A weekend checkout, maybe a few hours with a dealer pilot, and a new owner was loose in a machine that could outclimb most warbirds but would punish the smallest laps. The taxonomy did not help. Before 1974, the NTSB accident codebook lumped gear and flap errors under the label pilot mismanagement, burying the ergonomic flaw in a sea of human blame. Only after the code revision did the numbers start to show a pattern. The Bonanza's cockpit was a lesson in misplaced confidence. The buyers were smart, successful, and used to being right. The airplane required humility and a willingness to relearn. Most never got the memo. The result was a fleet flown by men who believed they could buy their way out of physics, and a ledger that began to fill with names. There is nothing theoretical about what happens to a Bonanza's tail at altitude. The drawings are still in the files: front spar, skin thickness, hinge points. In 1956, Beechcraft issued a change, 2 inches added to the leading edge of the V-tail stabilizer, a tweak meant to tame the stall. But the front spar, the backbone, stayed the same. On the bench you can see the weld line where old and new meet. That is where the numbers start to matter. Torsional load is not a pilot story. It is a force that twists metal running from the ruddervator tips straight into the spar root. The Bonanza's V-tail, with its shallow angle and long moment arm, is a lever for vibration. At a certain speed, call it the flutter frequency, usually above 160 knots, any flex in the spar becomes a feedback loop. The surface starts to oscillate, a blur you cannot see from the cockpit. The amplitude doubles, then doubles again. In a test cell, you can replicate it with a hydraulic ram and a strobe. In the air, it happens in seconds. The service bulletin files from the late 1970s show where mechanics were told to look. Cracks at the spar root, hairline at first, then growing with each flight. The engineering drawings highlight the hot spot, a zone about the width of your thumb, right where the extension meets the original spar. That is where flutter finds its anchor. Once the oscillation starts, the metalwork hardens, then fails. The stabilizer departs the airframe. Survivability is a coin toss above 500 feet, 0 below. Pilots called it the Wichita Wobble. But the real culprit is simpler, a resonance that the original design could not absorb, and a front spar that was never meant to carry the new loads. The V-tail's breakups did not wait for bad weather or bad pilots. They waited for the right combination of airspeed, turbulence, and a flaw that was drawn into the airplane the day the extension went on. The evidence is in the scrap bins and the NTSB photos, twisted spars, sheared bolts, and a vibration mode that did not care who was flying. Beechcraft's public statements never flinched. For decades, every press release and every quote to the trade magazines read from the same script, that the Bonanza was a high-performance airplane, and high-performance airplanes could be over-controlled by inexperienced pilots. That phrase became a shield. It showed up in AOPA newsletters, in the Wichita Eagle, and in a 1979 company memo that blamed accidents on pilot technique, not design. The numbers told a different story, but the official voice never cracked. When accident counts spiked in the 1970s, Beechcraft's spokespersons stuck to the script. One statement in 1978 said that no structural deficiency exists in the V-tail Bonanza, even as internal engineering notes flagged repeated spar root cracks. The company's legal team was careful. They never acknowledged a design flaw in public, and they never admitted that the 1956 tail extension had concentrated torsional loads at the spar. Instead, they pointed to the AOPA study that recorded 523 accidents, with 73% attributed to pilot error, and let the rest hang in the air. The press printed the quote, and the story moved on. Inside the factory, the numbers were harder to ignore. By 1982, the V-tail line was finished. Officially, Beechcraft called it a routine product line decision. There was no press conference, no recall, and no apology. The last V-tail Bonanza rolled off the Wichita line that year, serial block 1571025, but the company kept selling existing airframes through brokers and dealers for years. They stopped making it. They did not stop selling it. The silence was institutional. Every time a tail came off at 4,000 feet, Beechcraft issued condolences and pointed to the logbook. Every time a doctor or a lawyer wound up in a field, the press repeated the same line that the Bonanza is a demanding aircraft and must be flown accordingly. Behind closed doors, the engineering fix sat on a shelf, a pair of reinforcement angles and a weld. In the boardroom, the cost of admitting fault was measured against the price of silence. For Beechcraft, the story was always about the pilot. For the families, there was only the verdict and the sound of the company line, repeated until the last V-tail left the line in 1982. Wind tunnel models don't care about reputations. In 1988, the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Transportation ran the numbers the old way, a full-scale V-tail Bonanza in the NASA Langley Wind Tunnel, strain gauges wired to every spar and surface. The engineers did not trust Beechcraft's paperwork or the company's assurances. They wanted pressure maps, moment readings, and a margin of safety that could be measured in pounds, not promises. The results were blunt. At certified maneuvering speeds, the V-tail's front spar fell short of the regulatory load margin by more than 5%. That's not a rounding error. FAA's own report, AR88-115, spells it out. Under certain combinations of turbulence and pilot input, the stabilizer could enter flutter before reaching the published redline. Figure 5-4 of the report shows the pressure spike right at the weld where the 1956 extension joined the original spar. The numbers lined up with the accident debris, twisted metal, sheared bolts, and a failure mode that started at the root and finished in open air. The full-scale flight test at Edwards confirmed it. Control coupling torque maxed out at 55 pound-feet, 5 below the certified limit. That's a gap you can feel with a breaker bar in your hand. The FAA engineers did not mince words in the oversight memo. The V-tail as built could not absorb the loads it was certified for. Every airframe flying without reinforcement was one unlucky gust or one sharp pull away from joining the NTSB's list. The evidence was no longer theoretical. The certification gap was real, measured, and documented. The next step was mandatory, an airworthiness directive, and a fix that finally put metal where marketing had left a hole. The airworthiness directive came down like a verdict. A D88-2406, published in November 1988, was mandatory for every V-tail Bonanza still flying. The language is dry, almost bureaucratic. Install Beechcraft reinforcement kit per Service Bulletin SB 3511 within 100 flight hours. The fix itself is even simpler. Open the tail, drill out the old rivets, and bolt in a two-piece metal doubler, one stub spar, a pair of steel angles, and a handful of hardware. The parts list reads like a joke after decades of funerals. No exotic alloys, no redesign, just a reinforcement at the root where the torsion loads had always wanted to twist the stabilizer off. Labor estimate, 1 day, maybe 2, if the mechanic is careful with the paint. The kit costs less than a prop overhaul. The installation instructions fit on 3 pages. I have held the reinforced stabilizer in my hands. The original spar is scarred and work-hardened at the weld, but the doubler bridges the weak spot. You can see, plain as daylight, what was missing. This is not a miracle of engineering, it is a patch. But once it is on, the numbers change. The in-flight breakups drop from 3 a year to nearly 0. The AD does not mention the lawsuits, or the families, or the engineers who flagged the hotspot in the 1970s. It just lists the serial numbers and the torque values. That is what 75 families were worth to Beechcraft's legal department, 2 pieces of metal and a weld. The airplane flies on. The ledger closes, but the moral cost does not. The fix was always this simple. The hard part was admitting it. So which is it? Pilot error or structural failure? The answer is both. And for 40 years, one side used that ambiguity to let people die. I have held the reinforced stabilizer. The fix was 2 pieces of metal and a weld. That was what 75 families were worth to Beechcraft's legal department. The doctor killer did not kill doctors. Overconfidence did. And a company that had every reason to know the difference and stayed silent anyway is the reason it took 40 years to find out.